What I love about working in tech is we're constantly learning because the rate of change is crazy. The other constant is reinvention, where new becomes old and old becomes new, often with a twist. Now, the case in point today is the Lambdalith, which I stumbled across in an article by Yang Kui, and I'll link it below. Lambdalith is a portmanteau of Lambda and monolith, and I suspect now many of you will know exactly what this is. But let's back up a bit and quickly talk about Lambda. Lambda is a key component of AWS's serverless compute strategy. Now, while I'm a fan of serverless, I want to be clear and state that every system architecture is unique and there is no one-size-fits-all. But serverless, when AWS dropped it 10 years ago, represented a paradigm shift in building cost-effective applications and simplifying engineering teams, as you now no longer needed a dedicated DevOps capability. Take, for instance, container management. Kubernetes, as we know it, is extremely complex. Even using AWS EKS or even ECS, it's not easy to set up or maintain. But Lambdas abstract away the infrastructure entirely and give you virtually unlimited scalability and high availability out of the box. Now, I say this with lots of caveats, all of which I'm not going to go into now, maybe in another video. But if we look at this diagram, this is from AWS itself and shows you the architecture of a typical Lambda setup. Now, with this, Lambdas themselves provide a clean way to architect an API, which almost forces you to follow a process that separates the functionality of each endpoint into discrete chunks of code. These chunks of code are normally in front of API Gateway, which provides many features to manage access to them far beyond being a mere proxy service. The Lambdalith then is a monolithic chunk of code that could represent an entire application, and that I know will sound like an abomination to some of you. Now, if we look at a similar diagram showing the Lambdalith, you can see it's quite a bit simpler. AWS themselves only recommend it as the first stage of a lift and shift approach, where the Lambdalith gets broken up over time. So for instance, you might be moving an old application to serverless in its entirety and then breaking it up later. Now, while this sounds like something from a Japanese monster movie, I'm sure to some of you, many of the same arguments hold true for Lambdaliths as they do for regular monoliths. Easier maintenance for small development teams. The business logic is now, all in one place. Faster deployment, less overhead with code reuse, shared libraries can be patched in one place, and simpler testing. In addition, though, it can mean less latency or fewer cold starts, as a single function will be by definition more frequently used, unlike a regular application where the load distribution during the day might typically be over tens or hundreds of functions. And remember that cold starts typically only represent a tiny number of invokes, less than 1% in most cases, according to AWS themselves. But there is another plus, although it doesn't just apply to Lambdaliths. Sitting in front of Lambdas in most cases, as we saw in the previous diagrams, was API Gateway. API Gateway is expensive. In fact, as much as double the cost of running the Lambda itself in some cases. In the case of the Lambdalith, it makes sense to drop API Gateway and use function URLs or the application load balancer or even CloudFront instead for more complex, high-traffic situations. So in this cost illustration I'm showing here, I have typical costs for 1 million calls for both REST and HTTP version. I'm also assuming that we're using the lowest tier for API Gateway, which is around 333 million calls, a 100 millisecond execution time, and a half gig of memory, which might be fairly typical. As you can see, while HTTP is around half the cost of REST, using the ALB results in close to 70% saving. And obviously, if you don't need the ALB, it's even cheaper. So what are the takeaways? As tech leaders, we should always have our eye on costs, both platform and labor costs. Lambdalith could be an option to reduce both of these and not just for the lift and shift use case, because it's quite possible to imagine building an application abiding by separation of concerns to group endpoints using multiple Lambdaliths. Dropping API Gateway can bring serverless costs much more in line to the dream you were probably sold on with serverless in the first place. Thanks for watching.